I stood frozen at the top of the basement stairs, the echoes of terrified screams sounding in my head. The shuffling footsteps grew closer to the closed basement door. My right hand was sweating as I held my pistol, which was ready to fire with the pull of a trigger. I'd been in this basement for hours. Hours of straining my ears to hear what was happening upstairs. Hours of sweating and twitching. Hours of fear mixed with anger. The footsteps were very close now. I just had to hope they would continue past the basement door. The stairs were too creaky for me to retreat. I'd missed my chance to move back down into the basement. Now, all I had was hope. But as the footsteps stopped directly outside the basement door, I knew my hope was in vain. The door flew open and I raised the pistol, pointing it at the two men who stood there. My tough-looking, gray-haired neighbor and another younger man faced me. My neighbor, who'd said his name was Winslow the one time we'd met, peered at me with pale blue eyes. His face was splashed with blood. The younger man's face was bloody because he'd been struck in it several times. He seemed dazed, his brown eyes unfocused. Winslow was holding the man up with one muscular arm wrapped around him. The other arm held a pistol to the side of the man's head. Winslow's bushy eyebrows raised in surprise.
"Jason?"
he growled. The U-Haul arrived on a Thursday. It was the middle of the day, and I saw the truck through the kitchen window as I was going to get myself another cup of coffee. As was the habit I'd fallen into ever since I started working from home full-time, I jumped at the opportunity to do anything but go back to my home office. This seemingly innocuous occurrence, the arrival of a U-Haul truck at the house next door, was just the kind of thing to feed my voracious thirst for procrastination. After all, the house had sat empty for more than 3 months, which wasn't all that surprising with home prices being what they were. My wife and I even wondered if some giant corporation was going to buy the house up and turn it into a full-time Airbnb, as was apparently happening all across the country. We didn't want that. We had 2 young kids, and we knew all our neighbors by first name. If it was to be turned into an Airbnb, we would have to keep an even sharper eye out for our children. The never talk to strangers rule was in full effect, and that's all the house would bring, strangers. But with the sight of that U-Haul, I didn't think it was some corporation setting up to rent the house out. I figured it was someone coming to live here for good. So I peered out the window, which faced the house in question. By angling myself a little to the right, I could see the street and the truck parked next to the driveway. I waited there for several minutes, looking for movement, but I saw none. I was hoping to get a glimpse of the person or people who'd bought the place. But as my internal procrastination timer ticked down, I knew it was time to get back to work. So I poured myself a coffee and went back to it. A few hours later, when I came back out of my home office again to figure out what I was going to make for dinner, the truck was gone and the house was shut up nice and tight, just as it had been for the months it sat vacant. Later in the day, after my wife got home, I told her about the truck as we stood by the kitchen window, cleaning up after dinner.
"What did they look like? Is it a family?"
she asked.
"I don't know. Didn't see anyone. I was too busy working hard in my office all day."
Beth looked jokingly incredulous. She knew of my penchant for procrastination.
"Sure," she said. "Well, we should introduce ourselves once they get settled in."
"Of course," I said as we gazed out the kitchen window. There was a light on over there, but the shades were closed. Still, I could see the shadows moving beyond the shades. The doorbell chimed as I pushed it. I held a casserole in my left hand as I waited for the door to open. Over a week had passed since the U-Haul truck had come and gone. I still hadn't caught a glimpse of the neighbor, which struck me as odd. My wife had seen him early one morning when she woke up to use the bathroom and get some water. The guy had been on a ladder at the front corner of his house, messing with the floodlights there. It was a strange time to be doing something like that, but I figured he kept odd hours. When Beth told me about it in the morning, she described the guy as
"Like Clint Eastwood, but a bit younger and a bit thicker."
She said he had a head of thick gray hair and that he was clearly getting up there in age, but he was still spry enough to have no problem mounting ladders in the middle of the night. As I stood at his front door, I heard movement from inside. Glancing over into my own front yard, I waved at Beth. She was keeping an eye on our two boys, Stephen and Graham, who were kicking a soccer ball around. They still had a ways to go before their fine motor skills developed, but they were giving it their all, even if that meant falling down on occasion. The sound of two locks disengaging brought my attention back to the task at hand. Give casserole, make friends, and ensure our new neighbor wasn't a creep. I like to look for the good in people, but ever since having kids, I was more likely to look for the bad first. I guess a lot of parents feel that way. The door opened a crack, revealing half of a wrinkled face and a pale blue eye under a slanted and bushy eyebrow. "Hi," I said. "I'm your next-door neighbor. Name's Jason. Brought you some food that the wife made." The pale blue eye studied me for a moment, then peered beyond me. The door opened wider, revealing more of the man. He wore a tight brown t-shirt, the kind I'd seen muscular young men wearing. But it was clear at a glance that this man kept himself in good shape. He had jeans and tennis shoes on. Although I couldn't see much of the interior of the house, I saw no evidence of moving boxes. In fact, I saw little evidence of anything personal. No framed pictures, no extra shoes placed near the door, not even a coat rack. "Thanks, but I'm on a strict diet," the man said in a scratchy voice. He really was like Clint Eastwood. "Well, that's okay," I said, extending a hand out. "Anyway, it's nice to meet you." The guy took my hand and squeezed it firmly as we shook. "Winslow," he said. "Nice to meet you, Winslow. Like I said, I'm Jason." "Yeah, I heard." "Right," I said. "Well, just wanted to introduce ourselves." I stepped back from the door and gestured toward my front yard. "That's my wife Beth and my two sons, Stephen and Graham. Stephen's the bigger one." Winslow stepped out and looked at my family. His eyes caught on Beth. She waved at him, but he made no move to return the gesture. He simply stared at her. Seconds passed. Beth's expression changed from one of friendly openness to obvious discomfort. I cleared my throat, but Winslow didn't move his eyes from my wife. Thinking maybe he'd had a stroke or something, I reached out to touch his arm. As soon as my fingers met the shirt fabric, he snapped his arm up and grabbed my throat. I dropped the casserole, and the glass dish shattered as it hit the stoop. Beth screamed something inaudible, and Winslow suddenly let go. He'd held my throat for maybe 3 seconds. Stumbling back and nearly falling down the steps, I brought a hand to my throat, already able to tell that it was going to bruise. "What are you doing?" Beth yelled, running up. I was too stunned to say anything. I just looked at the old man, his bushy eyebrows raised high over those pale eyes that bounced from me to my wife and back again. As Beth came closer, the man retreated back into his house. But he didn't shut the door. He turned and fixed his eyes on Beth again as she came up the footpath. "We should call the police!" Beth yelled. "You just assaulted my husband!" The man shook his head, his expression hardening. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean it." The words rang hollow in my ears. And then he shut the door. The sounds of the two locks engaging were the last things we heard from him that day. But that was just the beginning of the horror we would come to face because of our new neighbor. I hadn't been in a fight since high school, and although the little incident with Winslow wasn't really a fight, it grew in my mind to feel like something of utmost importance. We didn't end up calling the police. We simply got the boys back inside and then went back over to clean up the broken casserole dish and the ruined food. The man stayed inside while we did that, although I had a feeling he was watching us. Or, more specifically, I had a feeling he was watching Beth. The way he'd looked at her stuck in my mind and made me feel a creeping sense of discomfort whenever I thought about it, which was often. He'd fixated on her with a burning hunger in his eyes. And for the next several days after the encounter, I lay awake at night, replaying it in my mind, growing more and more agitated. A sense of shame wormed its way into me like a parasite. I'd been easily bested by a man who was probably double my age. I just stood there and taken it while he choked me. I didn't even try to hit him or anything. What would have happened if he hadn't stopped? Would I have just let myself die without a fight? These thoughts and others like them chipped away at my sense of worth, at my manhood. I was supposed to be able to protect my wife and children, but if an old man could get the drop on me like that, what use was I? What if he decided he wanted Beth for himself? What if he wanted to take her and do something with her? What if he wanted to kill me and take my wife and children to his house to do God knows what with them? I didn't think I would be able to stop him. In those early morning hours when these thoughts plagued me, I pictured myself cowering in a corner, crying as Winslow walked into my bedroom and grabbed Beth up. I pictured myself staying in that corner, wetting myself as he left the house with my wife. In the light of day, I tried to convince myself that those thoughts were ridiculous. I told myself not to take what my dad used to call 3 a.m. thoughts seriously. But with every painful swallow, I was reminded of my humiliation. With every glance in the mirror, I could see the bruises on my neck. And to make matters worse, Beth said she felt like she was being watched whenever she went out to check the mail or play with the kids in the front yard. Of course, she'd noticed the change in me, but we hadn't talked much about it. The whole thing had thrown us both for a loop. So by the time it was no longer painful to swallow and the bruises were clearing up, I'd convinced myself that I had to do something to ensure I could protect my family. And the most obvious thing was also the easiest. So I went out and bought a gun, a pistol. But that only helped for so long. My depression grew, and with it, my anger. And 2 weeks after the incident, I knew what my course of action would be. Winslow had to have a past. If he was the man I thought he was, then I figured he maybe had spent some time in prison. Probably for rape or murder, or both. It would explain his muscles and his gruff attitude. So I made it my mission to find out all about our new neighbor. I managed to snap some pictures of him one night when I couldn't sleep. He was outside trimming a hedge in front of one of his windows, and I used my phone from an upstairs window to get his picture. I posted it around in the Nextdoor app and asked people to share it to see if anyone recognized him. I also contacted the county recorder's office about the property. All that information was a matter of public record. And when I got the info back, I found that the name on the title was Winslow Thurman. Armed with that information, I paid for a search on one of those online people finder websites, but it didn't come up with much at all. It certainly didn't say anything about him being an ex-con. Meanwhile, no one from the Nextdoor app recognized him. I was getting nowhere, but I knew something wasn't right about him. He rarely came out of his house during the day, and if he did, he got into his car in the garage and left that way. The only time I ever saw him come out during the day, not in his car, was when he assaulted me and basically threatened my wife. So when it was clear that I wasn't getting anywhere doing things the proper way, I decided I would take a different tack. I would break in and see what he was hiding. Winslow left his house around noon on a Tuesday, nearly a month after the incident. I had been paying attention and had noticed that he often left on Tuesdays, sometime between 11 and 1. So when his car pulled out of his driveway, I was pretty much ready to go. Beth was at work and the kids were at daycare. I walked out of my house through the back door. Like my house, Winslow's house only had a fence around the back. That meant that our front yards touched without any barriers. So I locked up my house and walked over into Winslow's front yard. I was dressed in normal clothes, slacks and a polo shirt. But under my shirt at the small of my back was a holster with my pistol inside. I also had latex gloves in my pocket, along with my phone for taking pictures of anything I found inside. Resisting the urge to look around like a guilty person would, I reached up and tried the gate latch to get into his backyard. The latch was locked. Getting on my toes, I peered over the fence and saw that the gate latch had a padlock through the hole, keeping the latch from lifting. I had wanted to make it seem like I had every reason to be there. That way, if anyone saw me, they wouldn't think much of it. But now that I knew the gate was locked, I went into my backyard and used a wheelbarrow to help me jump the fence into Winslow's yard. I checked the windows, finding that they were all locked. I also checked the back door, locked as well. But I'd come prepared for this. The family that lived in the house before it was put on the market had been pretty good friends of ours. The Diaz family consisted of a husband, a wife, and a teenage girl. The girl had watched Stephen and Graham on occasion, and we'd gotten together with them for barbecues and the like. But one day, Ray Diaz had accidentally locked himself out of the house. He'd come over to see if I knew of any way to get into a locked house. When I said I didn't, he asked to use my phone or computer to look up YouTube videos on how to break into your own house. Apparently, he'd been working outside in the backyard without his phone or keys when his daughter had left, locking everything and thinking that her dad was still inside. Together, we'd gone over and managed to open one of the windows without any tools and without breaking anything. Remembering that, I went to the same window at the back of his house, seeing that it was the same kind of lock. Winslow hadn't replaced the windows. The window was one that slid sideways on a track to open, instead of opening on a crank or sliding up. The locking mechanism was engaged, flipping down on the inside. First, I put the latex gloves on. Then, I popped the screen out and set it aside. I pressed both my palms against the window pane and started pushing it up and down inside the track. There was maybe a 1/4 inch of give, but it was enough. By pushing the window up and down quickly, the locking hasp was moving in the casing, coming up just a little bit with every up-down movement. I had to stop once and catch my breath, but I knew it was working. The locking hasp was nearly halfway up. A couple of minutes more and the lock was fully up and disengaged. I slid the window open and climbed through, closing it behind me. The dining room I was in held only a card table and a single folding chair. Since I knew the layout of the single-story house, I moved through easily, seeing that it was sparsely decorated. There was an old couch in the living room, facing a small television set on a beat-up wooden table. Seeing nothing of interest downstairs, I went upstairs and down the hall toward the bedrooms. There was no artwork on any of the walls, no pictures anywhere. At least, not until I got into the master bedroom. As I walked into the room, I stopped short, mouth falling open as all my suspicions were confirmed. On the wall next to the bed, there was a collage of pictures of my wife. Beth walking to check the mail, Beth watching over our sons, Beth talking to a neighbor. It was clear they'd been taken surreptitiously, most of them through the windows of the house in which I now stood. They'd been printed out on flimsy paper. The quality of the images told me the printer was old and outdated. The sound of voices from outside snapped me from my shocked stupor. It sounded like there were two men outside, and although I couldn't hear exactly what they were saying, it was clear they were getting closer. Moving across the hall to the other bedroom, this one empty, I cracked one of the shades just enough to look out. There was a Rick's HVAC van parked across the street. Two men in blue shirts and black pants were walking directly toward Winslow's house. I wasn't too worried about it. When they rang the doorbell and no one answered, they would just leave. But then I thought that Winslow could be heading back now to meet them. Moving swiftly and silently, I headed back to the master bedroom and snapped several pictures of the wall. Then, as I moved back downstairs, I realized I hadn't heard the doorbell ring, nor had I heard any knocking. I went to the living room and peered out a front window. I couldn't see the men, and the van was gone. They must have left, I thought, turning to head back to the window I'd come through. But as I stepped into the dining room, I saw one of the HVAC guys at that same window, looking to his right.
"This one's unlocked,"
he said, not quite shouting. I ducked around the corner, hoping he hadn't seen me. I didn't think he had. Then I heard the window slide open. What the hell is happening? I thought. Why are HVAC techs breaking into this man's house? Didn't matter why. I didn't belong here. I had to hide. I hustled down the hall, out of view of the dining room. I stopped at the basement door between the kitchen and the hallway to the den and the garage beyond. The basement seemed like the best place to hide. Better than a closet, anyway. I opened the door, the hinges blessedly silent, and slipped down the stairs. The stairs were wooden and creaked under my weight, so I shifted my steps to the outside edges and got to the bottom with a minimum of noise. The basement was stacked with boxes and had a queen bed leaned up against a wall near the water heater. The boxes were all labeled with the name Sandy. Sandy's clothes, Sandy's bedroom, Sandy's work stuff. I paid it little mind as I heard footsteps from upstairs. The men were in the house. There was a stack of boxes near the furnace, and I pulled them closer to the heater, sitting behind them. Together they provided a hiding place. Anyone looking hard enough would find me, of course, but it was the best I could do under the circumstances. I didn't know what was going on here, but it wasn't above board. Something bad was going to happen. I could feel it. So I pulled out my pistol and held it in my sweaty hands as my heart beat a steady tattoo against my ribcage. The footsteps above continued. It sounded like the men were walking into every room of the house. I could hear their muffled voices occasionally, but I couldn't make out the words. The basement door opened, prompting me to click the pistol safety off as the stairs creaked. I held my breath as the man looked around, suddenly realizing that I was right next to the furnace. If this was a legitimate HVAC visit, I would be caught when they moved the boxes to work on the unit. But it was my fear getting the better of me. Legitimate HVAC techs don't break into people's houses. These guys were looking for Winslow, or waiting for him to come back. The stairs creaked again as the man headed back upstairs. After the door closed, I released my breath and set the pistol down to wipe my palms off on my pants. I pulled out my phone and checked the time. It was nearly 12:30. Looking at the basement windows near the ceiling, I knew there was no way I could fit through them, not even close. Even my youngest, Graham, would have had a hard time fitting through. So I had no choice but to stay down here until whatever happened, happened. The footsteps upstairs had stopped, but there was occasional talking from the two men. Time ticked by. Nothing happened. Around 2:30, I decided to see if I could get out of the house without being seen. Beth would be getting home with the kids any minute, and I needed to be home when she got there. Since my car was still there and I wasn't dressed in workout clothes, I would have a hard time explaining where I was if I got home after her. And I couldn't tell her the truth. Not yet. Not until I got the police involved and showed them the pictures I'd found in Winslow's bedroom. So I crept slowly and carefully up the wooden stairs, stepping on the outer edges of the steps again. When I got to the top, I took a deep breath and calmed myself before putting my hand on the knob. I still had my gun in my right hand, and I turned the knob slowly with my left. When I got it open a crack, I peered through, looking for any sign of the men. Seeing nothing, I kept the door cracked and listened carefully.
I'm starving, Vic,
a voice said from close by. I pulled the door shut a little too hard, making a low but unmistakable noise.
You want something to eat?
The voice said.
Did you hear that?
Vic said from further away.
I heard my stomach rumbling. Why? What did you hear? The garage door? You and your goddamn stomach, I swear to God. Alex, you eat more than my 300-pound wife. So, you don't want anything?
Alex asked after a moment.
Because I'm gonna see what this asshole has to eat. It's not like he's gonna be needing it. No, I'm not hungry,
Vic said.
Christ.
As footsteps approached from nearby, heading toward the kitchen, my instinct was to run down the stairs, but I knew doing that would make more noise. So I stood there next to the door, frozen and terrified as the footsteps passed on the other side of the door. There was a soft mechanical hum suddenly, and Vic called from the other side of the house in a harsh whisper.
He's home. Alex, get your ass over here. He's home.
The footsteps hustled back past the basement door. Still, I stood frozen, unsure whether to try and make my escape or to go back and hide until everything was done. And as I stood there, gun in my hand at the top of the wooden stairs, my curiosity had its say. I wanted to know what was going to happen to Winslow. Part of me wanted to see him beaten to a pulp for spying on my wife. Another more civilized part of me didn't want any harm to come to him. But as I remembered the way I felt when he'd grabbed my neck on his stoop, how helpless I'd felt, that small civilized part of me fell silent just as the house did the same. There was no sound for a long moment. Then I heard the muffled thump of a car door closing, that mechanical hum sounding again, the garage door closing. Then I heard a door open. There was a grunt and a crashing sound followed quickly by a gunshot and a shout. I went stiff at my spot on the stairs as the sounds of a struggle continued. A man started screaming in pain. I couldn't tell who it was, but I thought it was either Vic or Alex. His tormented screams were like nothing I'd ever heard before, but underneath them, I could still hear grunts and crashes as a struggle ensued. Finally, the sounds of a struggle stopped, and the screaming man loosed one more ragged cry before a gunshot silenced him. Swallowing, I listened hard as angry murmurs came from that side of the house. Then shuffling footsteps approached. It was too late for me to move. I'd missed my chance. Now I just had to hope that whoever was coming this way wasn't heading to the basement. But as the footsteps stopped directly outside the basement door, I knew my hope was in vain. The door flew open and I raised the pistol, pointing it at the two men who stood there. Winslow had one of the HVAC guys around the neck with one arm, pointing a pistol at his head with the other. The guy seemed only half conscious, his face beaten and bloody. Winslow's bushy eyebrows raised over his pale eyes. His face was splashed with drops of glistening blood.
Jason,
He growled. I tried to think of something to say, but nothing came to mind. I just stood there dumbly, pointing my new pistol at the two men.
I guess you're here to assert your manhood.
Winslow said.
Come back later, will you? I'm busy right now.
He shoved the other guy forward, forcing me to step aside. They moved down the stairs. Winslow didn't even give me a second glance, like I wasn't a threat, like I wasn't someone to be taken seriously. A burst of molten anger sent my insides into a frenzy. I raced down the creaky wooden steps and pointed my weapon at Winslow as he threw the other man to the floor.
Why do you have pictures of my wife in your bedroom?
I shouted, unable to control the volume of my voice. Winslow kept his back to me, looking down at the man on the floor, pointing his weapon at him.
I'm sorry,
Winslow said.
I should have done my research. I mean, what are the chances? They're astronomical.
The anger flared.
What the hell are you talking about?
The man on the floor seemed to be regaining himself. He started laughing. Winslow and I stared at him like he was crazy.
What the fuck are you laughing about, Vic?
Winslow said, jamming the pistol into the man's forehead.
We saw the pictures,
Vic said, chuckling.
We saw them when we first got in here. So what?
Winslow said, but his gruff voice held a hint of panic.
You can see the house in them. Not hard to tell that it's the house next door. You'd have to be an idiot not to see that.
Winslow turned to me.
Is your wife home? Is she home right now? Oh, she's home all right,
Vic said, smiling with bloody teeth.
And if you do anything to me, she's dead, along with those two precious boys.
The world shrank to a pinprick as those words played in my mind, echoing and getting louder and louder each time.
What is he talking about?
I asked.
He's not talking about Beth and my boys, is he?
Winslow looked over his shoulder at me. His eyes said it all. I dropped my arm and turned toward the stairs, thinking only of getting home. It couldn't be possible. My family was safe. They were safe. They had to be. I would go home and see them eating their afternoon snack in the kitchen, or maybe playing in the backyard. A steely hand caught my shoulder.
Wait,
Winslow said.
Jason, just wait.
I spun on him, slapping his hand away.
What is happening? I'm sorry, Jason,
Winslow said.
I really didn't mean to bring this on you. I had no idea when I moved in that a woman who looked just like my daughter would be living next door. I was trying to hide. I was trying to hide and live out the rest of my life in peace. But Beth, she looks just like Sandy.
I shook my head, still not understanding.
These men,
Winslow said, pointing at Vic.
A couple of their colleagues raped and killed my daughter 5 years ago. And so I found those men, and I made the last moments of their lives a living hell. But their organization, it's not the kind that lets things like that go. So I changed my name and moved across the country, and then I moved again, and again. I was sure they wouldn't find me. I don't know how they did. It shouldn't have been possible.
Vic laughed again.
You pissed someone off, old man. Someone was posting your picture online and asking if anyone knew you. Considering that this asshole broke into your house, I'm guessing it was him. Anyway, it's amazing what you can do with consumer-grade facial recognition software these days.
My mouth dropped open. I had posted his picture in the Nextdoor app and asked my neighbors to share it.
Shut the fuck up,
Winslow said, smacking the guy in the face. Then he turned to me.
Listen, Jason, I need you to stay with me. We need to save Sandy and those boys. Beth,
I said.
She's not your daughter. Her name is Beth.
Winslow took a deep breath.
I'm sorry. We need to save Beth and those boys, which means you're going to have to help. They don't know that you're here. They don't know that you know. That's the only advantage we have.
As he spoke, he winced and grabbed at the area above his left hip. As I glanced down, I saw that he'd been shot. I just hadn't noticed until now. I looked up into his pale eyes and I nodded.
Tell me what to do.
I left Winslow's house on the opposite side from my own. My pistol was stuffed in my back waistband without the holster. This would make the bulge there less noticeable. At least, I hoped. I had taken off the latex gloves. The armpits of my shirt were drenched with sweat. but there was nothing to be done about that. Walking past Winslow's house and toward my own, I hoped the old man was right. And when I saw the HVAC van one house up from my own, I knew he was. They were in the house with my wife and children. I checked for mail at the empty mailbox, pretending not to notice the flick of the curtains in a downstairs window. I picked up a couple of sticks that had fallen from the oak tree onto the lawn. I then put them in a pile near the side of the house before returning to the walkway. As I stepped up onto the porch, I pulled my keys out. As I got to the front door, reaching out with my house key, the door opened and a gun was shoved in my face. I raised my hands, putting on my best shocked expression. It wasn't hard. A man with a twisted nose and stubble all across his head reached out with his other hand and pulled me inside, shutting the door behind me. In the living room, I could see Beth, Stephen, and Graham all sitting on the couch, all crying. A second man in an HVAC uniform was standing behind the couch with a pistol pointed at Beth's head, peering at me with concern. There were only two of them, just like Winslow said there'd be.
Where the hell you been?
The man in front of me asked.
Your wife says you work from home. Where were you? I went for a walk. I do that sometimes.
The sound of a phone ringing erupted from the living room. The guy behind the couch pulled out his phone and looked at it.
It's Vic,
he said, just before swiping up to answer it. There was a muffled pop from the backyard. The window behind the guy in the living room splintered as a bullet passed through it. Blood splattered Beth and the kids as the shot blasted through the man's chest. With all I had, I swung the keys in my hand at the other man's face, aiming for his left eye. With my other hand, I grabbed his right wrist and aimed the gun away from me just before he fired. The house key sunk into his eye with a wet pop. He screamed and lashed out with his other hand, hitting me in the face. Struggling, we fell to the floor, fighting for the gun. With my right hand, I reached back and grabbed my pistol. I brought it up and stuck it under his chin and pulled the trigger. His face disappeared, replaced by a bloody mess of bone and muscle. As I got to my feet, I saw that Beth had retrieved the other dead man's gun. She was pointing it in my direction, but when she saw that it was me, she lowered it. She was still crying. I moved toward her and the boys. There was a thump from the back porch. Beth screamed and swung toward the sliding glass door. She fired the gun blindly through the closed curtains and the glass door beyond.
Stop!
I shouted.
Beth, stop!
She finally did. I came up and took the gun from her trembling hands.
Are you injured?
I asked. She shook her head. I checked the boys. They were rattled, but okay. Then I stepped over to the sliding door, crunching on broken glass, and pulled the curtains open. Winslow lay on the back porch, 2 bullet wounds in his abdomen, one from earlier and one from Beth. Blood seeped out of his mouth as he looked up at us with those pale eyes.
Sandy,
he said, eyes fixing on Beth. He smiled. Then his head fell back and he stopped moving. But that smile stayed on his face. Thanks for listening. If you enjoy these stories, be sure to subscribe to the podcast and check out some more of my episodes here.